Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Allison McManus. I am the Managing Director for National Security and International Policy here at the Center for American Progress, and I welcome you all to our event today. In the first hours of the war in Iran, a U.S. Tomahawk missile struck an elementary school, killing 175 people, most of whom were little girls and their teachers. How could this have happened? A preliminary investigation has found that a targeting error led to the strike, which was meant to have hit an adjacent military base. But since this horrible tragedy took place, we've had no meaningful acknowledgement from President Trump or his administration. There's been no apology, no commitment to ensuring similar mistakes will not happen in the future. Sadly, this seeming apathy is not out of step with the attitude that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has adopted as he leads the Department of Defense, where he said, quote, "We don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. We untie the hands of our warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country," end quote. In today's discussion, we hope to better understand the consequences of the strike in this time of war and the implications for the future of warfare. This conversation is one of the latest discussions in a weekly series that we're holding about Trump's war of choice in Iran. We'll share more in the chat about how to stay updated on future discussions. For today, I'm joined by two esteemed guests. I genuinely couldn't imagine better people to help shed light on this tragedy and, more importantly, help us to understand its implications. Wes J. Bryant was the first ever branch chief of civilian harm assessment at the Pentagon's Civilian Protection Center of Excellence. He's a retired master sergeant and former special operations Joint Terminal Attack Controller, or JTAC, in the elite special warfare branch of the Air Force, where he led strike cells combating ISIS and other terrorist entities across Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Sarah Yeager is the Washington Director at Human Rights Watch. Prior to that role, she was the first senior advisor on human rights in the chairman's office at the Joint Staff of the U.S. Department of Defense. For nearly a decade, she was the executive director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict, some of you know it as CIVIC, leading efforts to advise warring parties on civilian protection and responsible use of force. Wes and Sarah, thanks so much for being here. Wes, we'll start with you. I think our audience, might be interested to hear your story, why you chose to join the Air Force, and then how your path led you to civilian protection.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm glad to be here. I wish it wasn't for these reasons, but thanks for having me. Why I joined the Air Force, I was a troubled youth. I think like a lot of young men that go into combat arms in the military, and especially special operations, as I ended up in. I just kind of wanted to leave my life behind. And that kicked off, a 20-year career in what I didn't know at the time, because I joined in '98 in the war on terror. Trudging around with infantry, with special forces teams later, as I joined special operations through Afghanistan and Iraq, and got the guy on the ground calling in strikes. As I became a senior JTAC, or a senior targeter, later in my career, then I was the guy, pushed forward into the special operations task forces, leading targeting and then strike operations. So in 2014, I helped stand up the Baghdad strike cell, conducting some of the first strikes against ISIS in Baghdad. That was under the what was called the Crisis Response Force that President Obama sent in to safeguard at the time Iraq and the capital against ISIS. And we know what developed from there. From then on, I served as the enlisted joint targeting lead for two separate strike cells later, one covering the Syria theater against ISIS. And then my last deployment was 2017, covering the Afghanistan theater again. At that time, we were striking both ISIS and the Taliban. And of course, we still had ground teams pushed out, conducting ground operations against both entities. And that was about 8 years ago. And we can talk about how I got pulled into the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence later on or next, if you'd like. But that's my military career. So
No, I'd love to hear actually, how did you go from, being on the ground doing spec ops, um, to then wanting to come into the Pentagon, presumably in an office, and doing civilian protection.
You know, well, I wrote a book with the former commanding general of Iraq, the individual General Dana Petard, who I served under in 2014, starting the strike cells against ISIS. That's called Hunting the Caliphate. So we worked on that for a few years, actually, through the end of both of our retirements. And I published that in 2019. And really, that was right after I retired from active duty. I was kind of done with everything, tired. Also, that was the first Trump administration. So I was done with that, but I had served over 20. And after I put that book out, that kind of catapulted me into national security and conflict analysis, really focused on strike operations. And from there, that I really continued and built that portfolio, if you will. At the same time, I started working in the defense technology industry, so I had a few years in that, working resilient communications developments, sensors and munitions. That was good experience. I don't think I ever want to go back to that industry, but it was good experience anyway. And then in 2023, I started full on doing not just analysis, but policy advocacy regarding Israel's war in Gaza. I was the only voice out there with my background and experience that was public at the time, and able to come forth and say, look, what Israel's doing in Gaza is not only wrong, but let me show you from a targeting standpoint and from a U.S. best practices standpoint, at least the best practices we used to exhibit, why Israel does not actually why the IDF does not actually have to conduct itself in this manner, contrary to what they state, of course. So from there, you fast forward to about early 2024, I had I worked for a Senate task force under Senator Van Hollen to basically push the Biden administration to stop sending arms to Israel because of the IDF's use of our weaponry. And I was on the news a few times talking about the IDF strike campaign and giving my analysis and comparing to U.S. best practices. And then that's what essentially, at the same time, you had the Secretary Austin standing up this CHIMR, this Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan. And part of that was the fulcrum at the Pentagon, the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence. And they were just getting up and running. So the man who would become my boss later reached out to me. This was very early 2024, and said, hey, based on we just had a phone call. I thought he just wanted to kind of talk and, get some of my experience for what they were doing. But it was essentially, based on your background and your experience, and then what you've been doing in conflict analysis focused on strike operations, civilian harm. Let me tell you about this new program. Also, we have the full ability to do direct hires and pull people in. This is Secretary Austin's number one priority at the time. So, of course, I was in. So it took a couple months to get processed into the Pentagon, but it was the most. I'd say the thing I've been most passionate about since I retired from the military, as far as a mission.
Thanks. And it's interesting, and we'll return to some of the threads that you started there to think about how your career kind of mirrors, the U.S. engagement in different theaters or support to allies, and how civilian protection norms have evolved. So we'll come back to that. But I know the reason that we wanted to come together today was to talk about the strike that happened at the elementary school. And Sarah, I know Human Rights Watch, does incredible documentation of rights abuses in many different contexts, but particularly during conflict, and that's sort of where you've sat throughout your career. And so I wonder if you could share with me sort of what has Human Rights Watch found? I mean, what happened in this strike? And then also if you can just share a little bit of your perspective. I mean, I know what you've worked inside and outside government, and a lot of what you do is, reaching out to government, trying to get information to better understand what's happening. What questions have been answered? What questions do you still have about that strike?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. So many questions, and everyone should have so many questions. Congress should have so many questions. So over the course of the 20 years that I've been working on this issue so we used to call it civilian protection. Some people still do, but that sort of feels like a proactive protection of a civilian population. And so what we've started to call it, and why the Pentagon called it this, was civilian harm mitigation. Because what we know, of course, is that when a military goes into a conflict, civilians are at risk. They are always at risk. I don't think there's any place on earth that you could fight where they're not at risk. And so they have an obligation to minimize the harm on civilians. And that is precisely what we've been working on for the past 20 years, to embed those best practices, lessons learned, doctrine, training, all sorts of elements that you can do to make sure that while civilians will remain at risk because you are at war, you can minimize that risk. And that's why it's so important that somebody like Wes, who actually understands military operations in very granular detail, was going into the Pentagon and doing precisely this. What we have seen over the past 20 years is that every time, I'm pretty sure every single time, there is a strike like this that harms some great number of civilians by the US military, there is an immediate knee-jerk reaction. We didn't do this. This couldn't have been us. It wasn't us. And then a couple days pass. And of course, it actually is the US military. So in this case, what we found was, and we knew that this was the US military, a US Tomahawk missile, well before the preliminary investigation came out. Because of satellite imagery, because of measurements of the missile, because of the trajectory, because of all of these different things. And we still have really significant questions about precisely what went wrong to cause this, because this is not, I don't think anyone believes that this was intentional on the part of the US military. But what we've seen over the past few weeks, even in 2 successive daily episodes from the New York Times, is that, it's being sort of written off as a mistake. And it very well may be a mistake, but it is also a violation of international law. This many civilians killed. It was a daytime, school day strike. Certainly, if this is distinguishing between civilians and combatants, if this is discrimination, then I don't really know what discrimination is. And what we're asking is for the investigation to also consider whether it was a war crime. And I'm sure you have lots of questions about all of this, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, can you walk me through, and this is, maybe to both of you, how should targeting happen? I know in this case, there was a massive amount of geospatial intelligence. We're looking to see, where there might be legitimate, and we can leave aside the legitimacy of the war entirely, which, obviously is being waged illegally and unconstitutionally. But in terms of what might constitute, a legitimate military target, a weapons depot, et cetera. In this case, it was, a military base. What are the different layers of safeguards that should be in place to ensure that this is indeed a military base and not a children's school, which, you could presume that even in satellite imagery, you could see that this is a school, right? So how is this supposed to happen? And also, I'm curious, let me just put it there. How is this supposed to happen?
Wes, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I'll say, speaking off what you just put out, Sarah, real quickly, what is most concerning is the aggregate of what's happening here with the use of military force under this administration. and Hegseth, and this just being the latest symptom of that. And then don't forget, we have upwards of 1,800 civilian casualties so far, and that's just without the smoke clearing. We all know there's going to be a lot more. What's most concerning about this, the Manab school strike itself, is that this is 101 stuff. If you even take out the civilian harm mitigation and response enterprise that we were initiating, to make us, and the whole goal of it was to find, sustain, and improves, as we call it, make the military better and better at consistently protecting civilians, because we found over the years, look backs on the war on terror, we had some successes, we had some massive failures, and there was massive inconsistency. And to be much better at responding to civilian harm, at conducting investigations and addressing it. As you see here, we're regressing in that regard too. But as far as this compound goes, very clearly, it was very easy for me to see right off the bat, before more information even came out, that this was a case of misidentification. But misidentification does happen, as Sarah pointed out. This is so egregious. The failures here are so egregious. I mean, you don't even, frankly, have to be a targeting professional to see how egregious these failures are. You have the compound of 7 to 9 buildings. This was a Iranian Navy missile headquarters. And I will point out, within that compound, there's a medical facility, also a protected entity that's not being talked about too much because the school's overshadowing for good reason. But as of 2013 imagery and data, that school, what's now a school, was a part of the compound. As of between 2016 to 2020, it was walled off from the compound. Now you see the play structures being put up, the blue and pink walls. Iranian Google Maps states it as a school. It's on websites, Iranian websites, as a school. All of these things should have been blatantly seen. I mean, from the imagery to the other, what we call open source data out there on this. And so what that tells me is the targeting team, to DIA, to Central Command, took decade plus old targeting data, map data, and a target set from, we scour and prepare targets for potential operating areas periodically, right? They took this decade plus old targeting data and didn't update it. It's right in our targeting doctrine, and there's many steps along the way in the targeting process that we will conduct as real time as possible characterization of anything we plan on targeting prior to actually executing it, and all the way through execution. And that means verifying it's a actual military target, still has military use, and then conducting collateral damage analysis and analysis of risk to the civilian environment. And very clearly, none of that was done here. So 101 stuff, disillusion of civilian harm mitigation response enterprise notwithstanding. It's like we're regressing, years backwards.
And I want to come in on this because it's really important that we understand that while we still don't know exactly what went wrong and what will come out from the investigation, what we are seeing from a Secretary of Defense who says no stupid rules of engagement, who says no quarter, I'm not entirely sure Secretary Hegseth understands that no quarter is a violation of international law, but regardless, we are seeing what is called a command environment change very much. So when I was in the first Trump administration, and I've worked with the US military for, so long, there are the people who would be louder than me about civilian harm mitigation are officers and commanders. They completely get why this is so important. And during the first Trump administration, there were some officers who wanted to take the gloves off, take the handcuffs off, one hand tied behind the back. We always heard about this. Most of the officers who I was working with really understood why these guardrails are in place, why you do a collateral damage estimate, why you look after the strike at a battle damage assessment to see if you've harmed any civilians, why you do a pattern of life analysis to understand what's going on in that place. How does the civilian population move? Where do they go? How do we make sure that we're not hitting them? Do we do it in the daytime? Do we do it at night? How can we best minimize civilian harm? And the US military was, not perfect, but was really trying and was most of the time very good at that aspect of targeting. And what we're seeing now in the second Trump administration with this Secretary of Defense is the command environment has loosened. Wes, I don't know what you would call it, but it has become so permissive. And it's very hard to make this link between, when somebody says no stupid rules of engagement, then you go and bomb a school. We can't make that direct link yet, but we really are concerned that the guardrails and this sense of wanting to do civilian harm mitigation has really come off.
Yeah,
Yes.
and just and I want to come to you on this, Wes, but I just really like this this lethality fetish that Hegseth has, really wanting to go in and kill people, to me does feel very out of step, particularly with many military, but an officer corps that usually prides itself on being professional. And for full disclosure, my husband was a naval flight officer, and so it feels very, the culture that he is attempting to foster feels very different than, a military culture that we've seen in the past. And that is still, recognizing that that's not to say that there have never been violations of IHL in the past, that there have never been, the U.S. military has obviously, committed atrocities in Vietnam and elsewhere. But there is something that feels unique about Hegseth himself. And so, Wes, I want to ask you, how do you think that this culture feels, for the U.S. military up and down chain of command? How do you think those kind of comments land? And, anything else you might have to respond to Sarah?
Yes, he sounds maniacal. He's stating intent for war crimes, consistently. And arguably, he has already been directing the execution of war crimes. Unprofessional is a complete understatement. And I know from experience, he hasn't changed. Look at everything he's done as far as firing people, firing lawyers, de-emphasizing, dissolving civilian protection efforts, de-emphasizing all of that aspect, and just talking about killing, and glorifying death and human and destruction and human suffering. He hasn't changed the DoD law of war on paper. He hasn't changed our targeting doctrine on paper. But I know from experience that, and this is leadership and management 101 kind of, right? The culture set from the top absolutely affects how things are carried out down to the bottom rungs. Also, when it comes to rules of engagement, I think he's being quite savvy in this case. Take the massive spike in civilian harm incidents that we've seen in the large-scale operations that have been conducted. Take Yemen last spring, and then now this Iran campaign. Massive spike from where we were previous as a Department of Defense. Our rules of engagement, which won't be released, of course, under this administration, may not say anything about an increased tolerance for civilian harm. They may not have what we used to call a non-combatant casualty cutoff value, where commanders could make a decision to potentially strike even if it was up to so many number of civilians were at risk. But anything a combatant commander says, Secretary of Defense and POTUS says, that would all be on secure lines trumps whatever's written down. And my suspicion here, which I believe to be true, is that, we see Hegseth is not only directing, basically massive amounts of strikes, both in Yemen and now. That I can assure you that this came directly from Hegseth to say, I want as much destruction as possible against Iran. And that creates haste and recklessness among the force carrying that out. which this is a symptom of as well, I believe. Also, I firmly believe that he is directing, at least in some instances, or possibly across the board, a higher tolerance for civilian casualties, where normally our tolerance from the POTUS down, with very few exceptions, like a bin Laden or a Baghdadi or someone of that stature, our tolerance is typically zero, at least in the last decade plus.
And yeah, no, and something else that I also wonder, I mean, not just in the field, but also thinking about in the Pentagon, the efforts that were made last year to offer early retirements, to we saw a lot of people leave, and I don't think we've had really good data to understand what rates of attrition were, how many people are actually there doing this work. But the attitude has basically been, that these are not necessarily, valuable jobs. And so when you think about who's doing some of the intelligence assessments, you have to wonder what sort of pressure they might be under to come up with targets quickly, and to feed those in, because, we want to go to war right now, and we want to, as he's been saying, want to have, quite a show of force at the beginning. So I think there's a lot of concerns there as well.
Yes, and I'll say, real quickly, I'll try to keep this short, but there's no way, just like the Yemen campaign, which was a microcosm of this at this point, there's no way we could have conducted even near real-time characterization of every one of these targets we've hit, these thousands of targets now. No possible way as far as civilian risk and civilian, what we call a pattern of life analysis. And, I've heard the excuses of, and we'll continue to hear these, fog of war, quote unquote, and well, civilians will die in war. Yes, both of those aspects are true. This is not fog of war, though. Fog of war is when you're pinned down in a wadi or a ditch, taking fire from multiple directions. Your friendlies are all over the place. You have no idea where you're getting shot at from, and you're trying to return fire. That's fog of war. A fog of war is not you have a year plus to prepare against strategic targets in a location where no U.S. troops are going to be on the ground in imminent danger, at least from their from direct action with armed forces. That's when it's time to get it 100% right. I mean, there should be minimal civilian casualties in this case with strategic, what we call deliberate targeting here, and we're seeing the opposite. If you look at most of the instances of civilian casualties from the war on terror, most of them involved dynamic fights, U.S. and partner troops on the ground intertwined with the enemy in civilian environments. That's a much more high-risk environment for civilian casualties. So that's why even more so, this is unacceptable.
Yeah, thank you. I want to, we've talked about this in a few different ways, but, how some of the norms around norms and policies, we could say, around civilian harm mitigation have evolved. And I'm hearing in some instances, it seems as though prior to the last year, the United States was actually maybe learning and getting better at doing civilian harm mitigation. And then obviously, the war in Gaza, which you mentioned, Wes, at the top, saw, really grave trends in terms of civilian harm, credible allegations of, not only violations of IHL, but some of the gravest violations of IHL, in some cases potentially amounting to war crimes. So I wonder if, and Sarah, I'll turn it to you. I mean, can you give us a sense of how are we doing? Is this moment in time, is Secretary Hegseth, is this an anomaly in an otherwise, positive trend towards doing civilian harm mitigation better? Or are we actually backsliding, into something that looks less like, that may be actually eroding these laws and norms overall?
So over the past 20 years, we'll start 9/11, just take that as a easy starting point. The progress on civilian harm mitigation has gone like this. So increasing in progress, but always falling back. So, every couple of years, there would be a huge outcry about civilian harm in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Yemen. And, commanders would say, we have to do something, or the politicians would say, we have to do something. And there would be these efforts to minimize civilian harm, and they worked. The thing is, we know what works. And so they'd put these things on top of operations and say, okay, now you can't call in close air support because that is what is causing the civilian harm. Or you can't set up these really quick checkpoints because that's where all the civilians are being killed. And we would see civilian harm go down, actual lives saved. And then those lessons would not be institutionalized. So that's what was happening over the course of 20 years. Finally, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin came in, signed his own name, which is incredibly important, to a memo that said, we are going to prioritize civilian harm mitigation, and we are going to institutionalize it. And that was incredibly important. We're going to put staff, we're going to put resources behind it. As soon as you have a budget allocation from Congress, you're making policy. I would not say that Hegseth is an anomaly for pulling us backwards. We finally had some institutionalization. He is an anomaly, certainly in his rhetoric, in his understanding of international law, or, depending on what's going on inside of his brain, his abandonment of the laws of war. But you look at the whole, if you look at the National Defense Strategy and Control F international law, you're not going to find it. You're not going to find civilian protection in that document or in the National Security Strategy. And so there are these very big policies coming out from the administration that show us very clearly that this is not a priority. And I don't think, one of my concerns is that we have to get back to institutionalizing what we know works. I don't even think that getting rid of Secretary Hegseth, for example, is going to do that. It needs to be a concerted effort, and I really think that it probably has to come from Congress. We need to start legislating these things so that we can't keep slipping back.
That's great, and I'm definitely going to come back to you on that point. But I want to ask Wes, I think sometimes there's this impression that civilian harm mitigation is like a nice thing to do. It's something the human rights community wants. But you mentioned also that this, both of you have mentioned this was something that was very important to Secretary Austin. And I wonder if you can just, from your perspective, share a little bit of what is the military or security reason that we want to do civilian harm mitigation. I recognize, obviously, there is a clear moral reason that innocent people should not die because, there's two combatants that are fighting each other. But, what is the sort of national security imperative to do civilian harm mitigation?
Yeah, as Secretary Austin laid out in the first line of his memo, we have a strategic and a moral imperative to protect civilians, and it's fitting with American values. And so, as you said, we understand the moral imperatives. I think anyone with a soul should understand that, and the legal imperatives. But there are strategic imperatives, and this is why all the combatant commanders were 100%, at least before Hegseth, behind this effort, the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response effort, and the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence. And those strategic reasons are, number one, look at the Manab school strike. When you put yourself in the situation in America, if we had another country coming in to take out the Trump administration, as much as many of us might want the Trump administration removed, and that country bombed our child's school in the process, we would not view them as the liberator. In fact, many of us would probably eventually, if not right away, take up arms against that nation. So that's a direct strategic implication. And if anything, swaying the population to our adversary's side or against our cause. And then we have, directly tactical, operational and tactical considerations. As it turns out, when you kill less civilians, you tend to be actually putting more of your resources toward killing the enemy. You tend to be killing more of the enemy. In certain special operations campaigns over the years, doing look backs on the causes of civilian harm, a lot of those over the war on terror were misidentification. I'll call the 2021 Kabul strike on the withdrawal from Afghanistan on the aid worker. Misidentification, thought an aid worker was ISIS-K. Now we spent how long watching this person, this target, developing it, how many resources, how many munitions and aircraft that went into this, and our enemy's over here somewhere. And now we also killed civilians. And then there's a credibility aspect for the military to the American people, to the globe, as far as upholding our values, that what we represent and stand for, to the law, from military command to our lawmakers and the president, at least previous presidents, Republican and Democrat, where, when you're killing civilians as a military commander, you're going to lose that credibility from the lawmakers and from any good president, as you should. So many factors go into this. And I think it was, McChrystal that said it well. He spoke, I think Petraeus said this in many ways too, that, we also risk, we did this saw this lesson throughout the war on terror, radicalization of individuals with killing civilian populations. That's not to say that every civilian population is just going to be radicalized. I don't want to lump them into that boat, but these are all strategic, very valid strategic considerations to look at. Protecting civilians is precision warfare. Hegseth seems to think that using precision munitions is precision warfare, much like Israel, but using precision munitions, en masse on massive urban populations and then disregarding the civilian populace to one degree or another and causing a lot of civilian casualties, that's not actually precision warfare.
Yeah, and precision means that you actually know what you're hitting. So,
Correct.
They hit perhaps what they thought they wanted to hit, but it turned out to be a school.
Right. And, in the case of Israel too, though, Israel's very precise. It hits almost everything it wants to hit. The IDF just generally doesn't care about civilian risk, has a high tolerance for civilian casualties. And so we have that aspect too.
Allison, would you like me to make us even more depressed since we're admiring the problem? Because there's a whole...
we're having a conversation about, a bunch of schoolgirls that the U.S. Tomahawk missile killed. So I don't know. I think people probably showed up knowing that this was not going to be...
It was going to be heavy.
Yeah.
There's a whole other aspect to this, which is that the United States civilian harm mitigation efforts were proliferating to the rest of the world. So part of what the Pentagon wanted to do with the CHIMR, civilian harm mitigation and response, was, proselytize to other countries, including all of our security partners. NATO created a whole civilian protection strategy that was really based in what the U.S. military was doing and some of these lessons learned that the U.S. military could share with its partners. And I cannot imagine that it will have any leg to stand on at this point in trying to proliferate civilian harm mitigation, even if we're able to bring some of this back.
Yeah. And I know that the reason that we're not receiving a great deal of support or really any support from some of our most stalwart partners, NATO allies, goes beyond just the civilian harm mitigation concerns. But it is telling that, aside from Israel, the U.S. is very much alone in waging this war and really has not, even though many of these countries are being very negatively impacted by the economic implications, are still saying, no, we are not going to take part in this war. It's not a theoretical, that is happening right now. We're getting some good audience questions, and do want to remind the audience you can put questions into Q&A. But before we go to those, I do want to raise the question of artificial intelligence. Seems to be coming up a lot with regard to use on the battlefield. Obviously, there was this standoff between Anthropic and the Department of Defense when Anthropic did not want to allow DoD to use its technology if there weren't bright respect for its prohibition on using the technology in lethal autonomous weapons or for domestic mass surveillance. We see AI deployed on the battlefield in Ukraine, et cetera. So this is a very timely question. And, when it comes to this strike, I think we saw the letter from a group of Democratic senators that asked, was AI used in the targeting? Some concerns that perhaps AI is not ready to be deployed. On the other hand, you could see, it would seem to be that if you had AI integrated appropriately, that it perhaps could have recognized very quickly that this was a school. Wouldn't have required a human review, and perhaps could actually have strengthened safeguards there. So, anyways, long-winded way of just if either of you have any thoughts about how AI may be positively or negatively used in civilian harm mitigation efforts.
I'll take this. I'm glad you mentioned that about identifying civilian risk as well. So really AI and targeting, because that was one of the things we were doing at the Center of Excellence as well. And I, of course, followed it previously in my previous career, was following developments in AI integration and targeting in Project Maven, for example. And really, ultimately, the stated goal has been data aggregation and refinement, because the military has been subject to data overload when it comes to combat environments. All of these different sources of things, and humans can't keep up. And so taking all of this data from all of these different sources and sensors and everything out there in the operating environment, refining it down to data that just that targeting team or that intelligence analyst might need. And then the people, the team, go from there and conduct the targeting in this case. And that's a very responsible use. I would completely welcome that. And I hope that's how AI is being used if it had been used in this campaign. I don't even think we'll know. I think this is an answer that the American people deserve, or at least our lawmakers deserve. And then there's the other aspect of, these are things we're working on, and we were just in, I call idea fairy mode. We were just coming up with these ideas to initiate from the Center of Excellence at the Pentagon. And that was, how do we now put attention in these AI developments and targeting, put attention on the civilian risk, so that at the same time, while this program is picking out potential targets for these teams, it's also red flagging and yellow flagging civilian risk. How easy would it have been to red flag these playgrounds, these play structures, and hey, does a military building have pink and blue walls? Double check that, targeting team. Double check that you sure you want to bomb a structure that has a play area and a sports field next to it. In the case even of the medical facility, there's signs. There's a large sign that could have been seen in certain imagery if we had it, or could have been sourced from online sources, right, with these AI programs. Absolutely could have helped mitigate this. So there's a double edge here. AI could have really hurt this if we're using it in the manner that it's been reported Israel has with Lavender, or it could have helped all of this. It could have stopped it.
So we have some questions from the audience. A couple of questions that are asking about the sort of more senior military leaders and the role that they might play. One of the questions is asking how much responsibility do, aside from Hegseth, other senior military leaders have when it comes to enabling, not specific to the school strike, but as this person has asked, yet another catastrophic war, after wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on, obviously in the first Trump administration, we did see, that we saw General Milley and others who, stood up to President Trump. Is there a reason why you think perhaps we're not seeing that same level of opposition at this point?
Yeah, I've been wrestling with that question. Wes, what do you think? Do you have a...
Uh, I see our senior military leadership completely laying down, whether they're aligned or complicit or just getting on their knees out of fear. I don't understand it. When I first whistle blew from the Center of Excellence last year regarding the dissolution of civilian harm mitigation, one of the things I was quoted on as saying is, I believe our senior commanders will be a shield against unlawful, unethical use of military force. And we've seen exactly the opposite. And I'm frankly shocked. And exactly the opposite being carried out by individuals, by senior, generals and admirals that, I otherwise have great respect for. I just wouldn't have expected any of this. And yes, absolutely. As far as all of the illegal use of force, and as far as incidents like this Manab school strike, it's not just on Hegseth. It's on the commander of the Central Command. It's on, the senior targeting officer, lawyers that were involved. Absolutely.
Wes, I really agree with you. There are some of these senior officers and commanders who I've worked with, and they have stellar careers. They are so principled. They believe in the laws of war and restraint, and all the strategic reasons for that. And they are still willing to, engage in extrajudicial killings in a fictional war in the Caribbean and the Pacific on boats. I mean, yeah, this is something that I've really been struggling with, and I don't think we understand why this is happening yet.
Yeah, it does. It's hard not to think about the dismissals very early on after Trump's inauguration of some of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, some of the judge advocates general. And it does seem as though the administration was intent from early on to send a message that, unlike in the first administration, dissent would not be tolerated. It certainly feels like a different environment than the first one. Question, I don't know the answer as to whether or not that has created, a more permissive environment for then more illegal military activity, because they feel more confident that they won't have people speaking out. But it does strike me that the abuses are worse, and the voices speaking out against them are fewer.
Yeah, what I've wondered is, with some of these, flag officers, is this what they've wanted all along, and they've just been waiting for the right people to come in and tell them they can? It really makes you wonder. But I have to believe maybe there's good ones out there we're not hearing about that are fighting, behind the scenes, hopefully, but they're not doing a good job of it if that's the case.
So another question, or sort of set of questions, and I realize we only have 10 minutes left, so maybe we can just use the rest of the time to kind of look forward and ask questions about accountability and sort of what can we do next. So one question, or what does accountability potentially look like? What should it look like? And I think I'm curious to hear, not just for this school strike, but Wes, you mentioned, have been other attacks on civilian infrastructure. And I think with some of these, we don't know whether they're U.S. strikes or Israeli strikes, but on desalination plants, on electricity grids, et cetera. What role, if the United States is either has actually perpetrated the strike or is simply, working in concert with an Israeli Air Force as they're carrying out these strikes, what does complicity look like, and what could accountability look like? So let's do that one, and then we'll come back to kind of what else could be done.
So accountability, I'll stick. Complicity is a little more complicated. I'll stick with just what should happen if the United States caused civilian casualties. And I think the circumstances are really going to matter when it comes to accountability. So in large civilian casualty events like this, I can't think of a particular time when somebody who was responsible for it was fired, demoted, prosecuted. I think that there was a letter of discipline here and there, which hurts a person's career, but basically you're not fired. And I think in this case, we really need to see some sort of accountability of that type, where somebody should be fired, somebody should be demoted, somebody perhaps should be prosecuted if this were a war crime. But then there's a whole other side of accountability, which has two pieces. And one is, this can never happen again. And that's a more complicated side of accountability, because it really does mean fixing whatever went wrong in this case, but then also making sure that that is institutionalized, and so that it doesn't happen again. And then there's the piece of it that is the families who have lost loved ones. And if this was a mistake, but also a violation of international law, there are payments that can be made. There are other forms of assistance. There are apologies that need to be issued. If this was a war crime, that's full reparation under international law, which requires something that looks a little bit different.
And can you speak, Sarah, to the complicity? This is a question that has come up. If the United States is not, again, directly responsible for attacks, but is joined in operations, is there any sort of complicity there? I mean, again, it seems as though there's been, for every day that the operations have continued, some concern that there has been civilian, again, either infrastructure, residences. Wes, you mentioned, the high civilian death toll at this point. What complicity does the United States have, even if we are not the ones who are actually dropping those bombs?
Yeah, and the United States does not have to drop bombs in order to be complicit in what the IDF, for example, might do. If the United States is presenting, it's been a long day. If the United States is giving Israel targeting information that led to that particular violation of IHL or that war crime that Israel may be committing, that's where we see complicity come in. At the same time, and while it's very important to call that out, again, we rarely see accountability for that kind of thing. And accountability for that needs to come from Congress. It needs to come from, we are no longer going to give weapons. We're no longer going to give intelligence, to make sure that kind of thing, that kind of partnership stops.
So let's, use our last few minutes here to really talk about, what should Congress be doing right now? What should Congress be doing as this war is going on? And again, as day to day, we are seeing strikes that are ruining innocent people's lives. What can they be doing in the future to make sure that this, I think as you've both laid out, to sort of return to and strengthen civilian harm mitigation efforts for the future. And then we have one question from the audience that I want to throw in there, which is just, what can ordinary people in the United States do to help ensure that these tragedies don't happen again?
Sure. So ordinary people can be upset. Write letters to the editor in your local newspaper, or contact your congressman and congresswoman. That's really, really important that they hear that you are upset about what is being done in your name. I think what Congress needs to think about, and I appreciate that many House members and senators have been calling for a thorough investigation into the Manab strike. I think they need to dig deeper, and I think it probably warrants a hearing to understand exactly what guardrails have been coming off of U.S. military operations. What are the restraints that we have lost under the Trump administration? Because it's everything from that NDS, which is so aggressive and doesn't mention international law, to civilian environment teams that were fired, to the senior military lawyers that are no longer there and overseeing, legally these operations. There are so many things that are happening, and it's a system. It is deliberate crippling of the system that we have built of civilian harm mitigation. I think that's what Congress really needs to dig into, and then figure out, coming from the answers that come from that, the kind of legislation and authorities that Congress can use to put things back in place.
Wes, any thoughts? I mean, again, just you saw some of this as it was actually being built and saw the potential. How can we reclaim that?
I echo what Sarah said, absolutely, and she's the expert in that regard. It's hard for me to have hope right now, I think, like a lot of people, frankly, until the Trump administration either somehow miraculously turns a new leaf or is gone. What I do have hope, though, is for after, post-Trump 2.0. I can't see that some semblance of what we had before and some semblance of proper professional military culture and real warfighting ethos, which has ethos included, not just death and killing and blood, is returned back to the leadership culture of the U.S. military. That can't not happen. I mean, eventually we'll get through this, but I just don't see a return of any of this until, at the very least, Hegseth is out of the position of Secretary of Defense or War. And maybe there's hope that, with all of the heat that's continually coming down on him, maybe Trump will bend at some point. We've seen that happen, and just not want to deal with that anymore and switch him out. That would be a fairly good outcome. But I don't think it's going to get, we're going to have like a full renewal of what we need to have in the Department of Defense and the military until Trump is replaced. Sorry to sound dismal on that, but that's my position.
And I really do feel like in the bigger picture, the United States government is misusing the U.S. military in this moment on at least 3 different continents. The American people should be very upset about that. We have a professionalized military that is highly regarded all over the world, and they are being misused.
Yes.
Well, thank you both. I think these are, really important insights, particularly since, this war is continuing, despite very conflicting timelines that we've heard from, it's almost done to it could go on forever. We don't know when it's going to end. And again, every day, innocent civilians are losing their lives. I think it's going to be some time before we're able to really fully take stock of the consequences of that. And we also know that there are going to be pretty difficult decisions that Congress will have to make in potentially relatively short order about whether it's going to continue to provide funding and additional funding for this war. And again, as Sarah, you mentioned, this is not something that is limited just to Iran, but we know that there's continued military activity in the Western Hemisphere as well. And now, Trump seems to be increasingly talking about some type of action in Cuba. So, sadly, it just seems as though these are questions that we are going to have to continue to grapple with. Wes, to your point, I think we all here at CAP firmly believe there's going to be life after Trump, and that it is extremely important that we think about how we build a better world, when and if we have the opportunity to do so. And so really appreciate you both sort of thinking through that with our audience, and hope that we can keep in touch and think about, what do we need to do to really rebuild those protections, those guardrails here in the United States. How can we, have the United States be a place that wants to work with others who uphold those values as well, and try to ensure that, we see more people protected in the future. So thank you so much, both. Thanks so much to the audience. And again, we will be continuing these discussions on a weekly basis. So hope to see some of you again.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you, guys. Great
Thanks.
discussion.